Loss aversion. People tend to prefer avoiding losses over acquiring equivalent gains. For example, losing $100 feels more painful than the joy of finding $100. Anchoring effect. The first piece of information offered, the anchor, influences decision-making and estimations, such as being influenced by a starting price in negotiations. Mental accounting. The tendency to separate money into different accounts based on subjective criteria, such as spending more freely from a windfall than from earned income. Endowment effect. Valuing items more highly simply because we own them, evident in scenarios where individuals are reluctant to part with items they own, even for items of equal value. Herding behavior. The tendency to mimic the financial behaviors of the majority, such as following investment trends without independent analysis. Hyperbolic discounting. Valuing immediate rewards more highly than future rewards, which explains why some struggle with savings and prefer immediate gratification. Status quo bias. The preference to keep things the same by doing nothing or sticking with a decision made previously, such as keeping a subscription service because it's been active for a long time, regardless of its current value. Confirmation bias. The tendency to search for, interpret, and remember information in a way that confirms one's preconceptions, affecting financial decisions by focusing on market information that supports one's investment choices. Prospect theory. Describes how people choose between probabilistic alternatives and assess the risk of loss, leading to inconsistent decision-making in risk-averse and risk-seeking situations. Sunk cost fallacy. Continuing a behavior or endeavor as a result of previously invested resources, time, money, or effort, like watching a bad movie till the end because you've paid for it. Framing effect. How people react to a choice depends on how it's presented or framed. The same outcome can seem more or less attractive based on the wording or context given, affecting decision-making processes. Choice architecture. The way in which choices are presented to consumers affects their decision. This includes the order of options, the manner of presentation, and many other subtle cues that can significantly influence decisions. Availability heuristic. People estimate the likelihood of events based on how easily examples come to mind. If something can be recalled quickly, it's often seen as more common or likely. Hindsight bias. The tendency to believe, after an event has occurred, that one would have predicted or expected the event. It is the "I knew it all along" phenomenon. Overconfidence bias. When someone's subjective confidence in their judgments is reliably greater than their objective accuracy, especially when confidence is relatively high. Time inconsistency. The tendency of the human brain to value immediate rewards more highly than future rewards. This leads to decisions that are inconsistent over time. We might plan to save money next month, but decide to spend it when next month comes. Default effect. When given a choice, individuals are more likely to select the default option. For example, being automatically enrolled in a pension plan increases participation rates. Altruism. The behavior of people who act in a way that is not directly beneficial for themselves but beneficial for others, challenging the traditional economic assumption that individuals always act purely out of self-interest. Ego depletion. The theory that self-control or willpower draws upon a limited pool of mental resources that can be used up. When the energy for mental activity is low, self-control is typically impaired, which can affect decision-making. Nudge theory. The concept that suggests subtle policy shifts can nudge individuals towards more beneficial behaviors without restricting their freedom of choice. For example, placing healthier foods at eye level nudges people towards making healthier food choices. Bandwagon Effect. The tendency of an individual to adopt beliefs, goods, and technologies as more people adopt them. It's similar to herding, but emphasizes the adoption of trends and innovations. Decoy Effect. When consumers change their preference between two options when presented with a third option that is asymmetrically dominated, inferior to one option but not both, making the dominant option more attractive. Dunning-Kruger Effect. A cognitive bias wherein people with limited knowledge or competence in a domain overestimate their own ability, while experts underestimate theirs, misjudging their level of expertise. Empathy gap. The difficulty of understanding one's own and others' feelings or reactions when in a different emotional state, impacting decision-making and judgment. Pain of paying. The discomfort or psychological pain associated with the act of spending money, affecting consumer behavior and the enjoyment of purchases. Paradox of choice. The phenomenon whereby having too many options to choose from can lead to anxiety and make decision-making more difficult, potentially leading to dissatisfaction with the choice made. Peak end rule. People judge an experience largely based on how they felt at its peak, most intense point, and at its end, rather than based on the total sum or average of every moment of the experience. Priming effect. The influence that exposure to earlier stimuli has on the response to a later stimulus, without conscious guidance or intention, affecting decisions and judgments. Relativity trap. The tendency to make decisions based on comparative rather than absolute advantages, or judging the value of something not in isolation, but in comparison to something else. Zero risk bias. The preference for completely eliminating a risk over reducing it, even when the alternative offers a greater decrease in overall risk. Regret aversion. The tendency to avoid making a decision that could lead to action for fear of it turning out to be wrong. People influenced by regret aversion might prefer to maintain the status quo or choose an option that minimizes the potential for regret, even if it's not the best possible choice. Information cascade. A situation where individuals, having observed the actions of those before them, make decisions based partly on their own information and partly by imitating others. This can lead to rapid shifts in societal norms or markets, not always based on fundamental information. Ostrich Effect. The tendency of people to avoid information that might lead to discomfort or require difficult decisions, similar to the myth that ostriches bury their heads in the sand to avoid danger. Disposition Effect. The tendency of investors to sell assets that have increased in value, but hold assets that have decreased in value, contrary to the rational decision-making model's expectations. Satisficing. A decision-making process that aims for a satisfactory or good enough result, rather than the optimal solution. This concept acknowledges the limitations of time and cognitive resources in decision-making. Bounded rationality. The idea that in decision-making, the rationality of individuals is limited by the information they have, the cognitive limitations of their minds, and the finite amount of time they have to make a decision. Base rate fallacy. The tendency to ignore general statistical information, or base rate, in favor of specific anecdotal information, even when the latter is less reliable. Commitment and consistency bias. Once people commit to a course of action or belief, they are likely to justify it and continue on this path, even in the face of contrary evidence. IKEA Effect. The tendency for people to place a disproportionately high value on objects that they partially assembled themselves, regardless of the quality of the end result. Outcome bias. judging a decision based on its outcome rather than how exactly the decision was made in the moment. This can lead to inappropriate judgments in assessing someone's decision-making skills.